Go.
Welcome to EcoLogic for the month of July. Nice, beautiful, warm part of the year. Tonight's topic is running the Mississippi River from St. Louis to Butler Rose, Louisiana. Sarah was my co-pilot and guide.
Navigator.
She kept track of where the rocks were. She missed one of them. We whacked into one set of rocks. That was the only one. Then she led us over a sandbar, but it was deep enough where the boat could float off. So that was our only casualties on the trip. And so we left July 2nd, just below St. Louis, on a trip that was about 880 miles to Butler Rose. And Sarah shared with us your vision. When I asked you about this trip, I was kind of thinking, Lord, she would never agree to such a thing. But she agreed with great excitement, and I think, Sarah enjoyed this trip.
I think our lives together began with a lot of great excitement, and I have jumped in a boat and followed you anywhere you wanted to lead me. And it's been a journey, and this was no exception. It was quite a journey down the Mississippi River, and one that we had talked about doing for a long time. So I'm glad we did it. And somebody asked me the other day, would you do it again? And I said, well, of course. And I want to show you the picture of the boat I'm going on this time. It's the American Queen paddle boat that we passed on our way coming down the river.
And one thing that was impressive about the river, how big it was and how much commerce is on the river. It's to a wilderness area. You see very few homes. There you see, wow, what a paddle boat. And as we went by this paddle boat, it was being approached from the rear by a tow with about 60 barges. It was about to pass this guy up. So the river boat was, I don't think, as fast as the towboats. This is going up current. I think this was somewhere along in northern Arkansas.
It's July the 3rd. We figured they were going on the July 4th river
July
trip.
3rd would have been between Caruthersville and Greenville, Mississippi. This is the only passenger boat we saw on the river. You would think all the stories you hear about the Mississippi and the paddle wheels, this is the only one we saw in actual motion. And we saw one person in a kayak, and quite a person. Janet
Moreland. And she has, as a challenge to herself and to women, as an opportunity to realize that hard challenges we women can make. And she went down the Missouri, where it met up with the Mississippi, and all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. She's quite a lady, and her excursion now is from the beginning of the Mississippi River up at Itasca Lake in Minnesota, and she's going all the way down. Harold tried to get her to come over, cross over into the Chaffalaya, but she said nope, she's going from the source of the river to the end of the river. She will end up in Venice sometimes within the next month or two. Or she may be there now, who knows?
The day before, which would have been the 1st of July, she had paddled 65 miles. And that was on the upper river. We met her about 60 miles below St. Louis, a real part of the beautiful part of the river, where on the west side of Missouri you have these big rock cliffs that are 400 or 500 feet. That's being in some places reduced to rubble to bring to, I guess, sites down the river, and also to shore up Louisiana's eroding coastline. Here's a little
There's
boat
our
we
boat.
were in, a 16-foot flat built by Boat Baycraft in Laurelville, Louisiana, 1971, and a little 40 horsepower Evinrude E-Tech motor, which did phenomenal on the trip. In 870 miles, we burned 74 gallons of fuel, ran about 34 hours, averaged about 25.5 miles an hour.
There's the Arches at St. Louis, Missouri. It's the gateway for all of those heading out to plow through the west and westward motion. And it's there to honor all of those pioneer people that do all kind of adventurous type of things. And that was surely those who started our country spreading out towards the western states.
And the arch is parallel to the river. It doesn't go across the river. It's right near the Eads Bridge. Eads was the guy that was, I guess, a diver on the river originally. He had the task of building the ironclads for the Union. The Cairo is one of them that is now at Vicksburg. It was sunk by the Confederates, but they retrieved it, and it's in the Vicksburg Battleground Museum. It was built by Eads at St. Louis. He had a contract to build, I think, 8 of the ironclads in 6 months, which he delivered on. Quite a feat, and wartime is an amazing thing. But all down the river, there's evidence of the Civil War. There's Vicksburg. There's, of course, Osceola was a fort in Arkansas, and then other sites that were involved in the war. Of course, Port Hudson, big battle on the river below New Orleans, to capture New Orleans early in the war. Here we are on the river, probably in the pouring down rain. In the first day, we had about 3 or 4 hours of pouring down rain running down the river.
They say up at the beginning of the Mississippi River that the elevation is 1,475 feet, and we travel 2,552 miles to the Gulf of Mexico to 0 elevation. And that's kind of an exciting thing. And we saw all of those nice high cliffs, a lot of sandbars, a lot of sand cliffs and sand banks. And you know, I even saw those when we got back to our area in Louisiana, and I didn't realize how much sandy stuff we had all along the banks of the Mississippi.
This was stopping for fuel, I think, in Caruthersville, where the police there was very nice and helpful. Was wondering how many fish we caught, and we announced that we were not fishing. Of course, I was concerned about fishing licenses, so, but you know, that trip took us through 7 states, and it's the borderline of these states. And in many places, it's where the river changes course. So at times you're going through Louisiana on both sides, and then Mississippi on both sides, and so forth as you go down the river. The river has a powerful current. It's big. It's a mile across in a lot of places. Where the bridges are is where the river's the smallest, the narrowest, generally speaking. And below St. Louis, all the way down to Old River Control Structure, there's only 12 bridges. So that's 840 miles, 12 bridges, about 1 every 100 miles. But there's some places where you go almost 200 miles between the bridges.
And the bridges were absolutely gorgeous. They were all old, original bridges with lots of intricate.
Cape Girardeau, Missouri, right there.
And like in Chester, Illinois, that was a famous bridge, as it had a lot of the trusses up underneath it. Hey, and by the way, enter David Begnaud, who was our ground support and a wonderful friend to have traveled with us all the way on this journey.
It was quite an adventure
Yeah.
to be with y'all on that trip, you know. It was really a great experience to feel.
Yeah, my next bucket list on the Mississippi is to drive it all the way up to Minnesota.
Well, I got to drive
Because you got to see a lot of beautiful things that we did not get to see.
Right.
Interesting towns like Osceola, isn't there a fort there? That's the first county in Arkansas, I
I'm
think.
not sure if they had a fort there, but to see all these delta towns along the Mississippi River, they're just beautiful towns. Unfortunately, most of them have a lot of depression, not blight, but they have beautiful downtown districts, and most of them were pretty much boarded up and deserted. It's really something to see that traveling down that river like that.
Rich farm country.
Right.
And you might share with the audience the kindness of some of the people who helped you, especially the guy around Green.
Yeah, everywhere along the way, everybody was so friendly. I needed some directions to find a boat ramp. It's one thing to see a boat ramp on a navigation chart, but to try to find it in a vehicle was another thing, because we carried navigation charts with us, and the road maps wouldn't show where they were at. So I'd have to ask for directions sometimes to find the boat ramp that was on the Mississippi River. And some of these boat ramps are really, really out of the way. It wouldn't be a public boat, it would be a public boat ramp, but it's kind of in the middle of the woods and so forth. This one was easy to find. This is in New Madrid, right here, and this is the weather I was looking at, and I knew Harold and Sarah were in that weather at that time. And at the same time, we had somebody from Lafayette sending us some radar shots to them, which really didn't mean anything because there's nothing you can do but keep rolling.
Put on the rain gear and keep going.
We were pulling out the
So you'll see in a
equipment.
picture that they were traveling with some really nice industrial rain gear. I believe that's coming up in another shot or two. Bring that
There
up.
we are in the
There they
rain
are.
gear. We just run through 3 hours of rain.
Right there, and so that was fuel stop number 2 of the day right there. And you typically get about 110 miles, I believe, out of a
On a
tank.
12-gallon tank, yeah.
But you had a range of, where you could probably push it to almost 300 with the fuel
Yes,
you were
I was
carrying on
carrying 30
board.
gallons, and I was running a little better than, about 11 and a half miles per gallon, so I
Right.
could have gone 350 miles,
Yeah, easily.
theoretically, yes.
And this is in Carruthersville, early in the morning. We typically launch the boat right after daybreak in the morning. And we were using modern technology by way of an iPhone app, what was it called, Find My Friends,
Yeah.
where they could see where I was at and I could see where they were at. And when we started this trip, I thought I was have plenty of time to get well ahead of them, but they don't have any traffic lights, or once they're in that river, they're running 25, 30 miles per hour. And I'm trying to find my way back to a main highway to get to the next town and start looking for the next boat landing and so forth. So it was always cutting it close before we get to the next stop, which was typically 100 to 150 miles to their next stop, where we really didn't actually know where we were stopping. It was just timing, where we would pull them out of the river for the night and so forth.
One of the things that, I guess I thought we'd see other boats and things on the river, but I always saw were big tugboats and barges. And they pushed up a nice big wake in front of them and a huge paddle, just turmoil afterwards for 2 or 3 miles. And we kept running across these. Harold loves to tell the one that he saw, which was the largest.
Yeah, it was 9 barges wide and 10, so it was pushing 90 barges. That was the biggest ones. Most of them were pushing 50 or 60 barges. They were like 6 wide and 6 or 7 wide and 8 or 9 deep. So 50 to 70 barges was kind of typical. And most of these are grain barges. They're covered. They're carrying corn. They're carrying soybeans. They're probably rice, wheat. You know, the breadbasket of the nation, all along the delta, which we could not see. You're constantly in a forest. You don't see. That's the water tower in Carruthersville. I think it's made to look like a steamboats.
Yeah, that was actually an old one built in the early 1900s, the original water tower.
But at New Madrid and all those areas, that's beautiful farm country where they're raising corn and cotton and soybeans, even rice down in Arkansas.
Right.
It's magnificent, beautiful country, just green and rich, and it's amazing. And of course, the barges are carrying it, you know, and it's amazing. At Cairo, Illinois, the Ohio River comes in, and the Ohio is attached to the Illinois and the Tennessee. The Ohio goes way up into Pennsylvania. It's got 980 miles in its length, and there's commerce all along the way. So the barges really got thick when we got in what they call the lower river below Cairo, Illinois. And these big tows cannot go through the locks. The locks are typically 1,500 feet long and 85 feet wide. So 2 40-foot barges and probably 7 long can go through. So the tows have to be broken up and made much smaller. And above St. Louis, they only maintain depth at 9 feet, they being the Corps of Engineers. Now, below St. Louis, with the river, a depth finder going, the river ran from roughly 24 feet to around 45, 50 feet at its deepest. And there were spots where you'd be running in 25 feet of water and it dropped maybe to 45 feet of water. It was kind of like going down a hill in the river. I'd never experienced that. There was a drop of 3 or 4 feet, like going down a very long wave. And I'd never experienced that in the Chapelaya, but it's kind of unique to experience that in the Mississippi.
Okay.
That's,
This is some of the sites that I would stop along when I'd have maybe 5 or 10 minutes to get ahead of y'all. This is Osceola, Mississippi. And this town had beautiful buildings downtown. They were all empty except for 1 or 2 in the courthouse. And they have these monuments all over town. And there were several famous musicians that came from that town right there. And they're all listed. They talk about them, all these different musicians, Albert King and so forth. So I have a few minutes to grab a few pictures. And then this is the depression I'm talking about right here, the abandoned buildings and not much going on down there. And so I don't know what the major industry is now up there.
maybe agriculture, right?
Agriculture, and I saw a lot of agriculture, especially when we got down into Mississippi like this right here. As far as the eye can see, you would be on roads where you were traveling through with green stuff like this on both sides of the road. It was an experience to see.
Cotton, corn, soybeans.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is through the New Madrid Fault, which in 1811, 1812 was a Category 8 on the Richter scale, enormous earthquake that caused the river to go backwards for 7 or 8 days.
Yeah, they say it lasted a long time. The earthquake lasted for a long, long time.
Yeah, through 2 days. They say like 11th, I don't remember the exact date, but
okay.
of great magnitude, and there's a major fault line that's there, and of course it's an area that could, suffer new earthquakes.
Yeah, we have some pictures on there of New Madrid fault line on there. So
And this must have been at Osceola.
this was right outside of Osceola, where I found a boat ramp where I could meet y'all, and that was a real pretty spot. It would be a great spot to camp out at. They had little pavilions, so it was pretty much in the middle of nowhere. The nearest thing would be a grain elevator next to it. And I believe I have some video footage coming up, maybe 1 or 2 slides down, that shows the power of that river. When you were coming in the boat, where the boat is being pushed sideways as you're trying to come in. Right here, you can see the boat. Is that
You
the
see the
video,
boat, do
Tim?
I need to move?
The video's coming in, and you can see that current going all different directions, and it's hard to see, but
There it is,
he's under quite a bit of power right now in that boat, and the river's pushing him downstream as he's coming in.
Running 3 or 4 miles an hour.
Okay, so that was your typical fuel stop, and Harold actually got out of the boat at that stop right there. Typically, he wouldn't get out of the boat from sunrise to sunset, but we got him out of the boat for 5 or 10 minutes to sit down and eat a snack and drink a Dr. Pepper, and then take off in the river again. I believe the next stop after this was Memphis. Passed through Vicksburg, but I don't think you stopped in Vicksburg.
No.
No,
I think you
well,
kept
below
going.
Vicksburg.
I think we lost
Well, I stopped and threw y'all a hamburger in Vicksburg.
Below
Yes.
Y'all
Vicksburg.
pulled up to the boat. There's a typical tow. That's when you got out of the
In
boat. Right
pride.
there. Right there. Everything. So,
But we had brought some, canned cold drinks, some aluminum canned drinks. I think we had 10 Dr. Peppers, and not one of them survived the first day. Every can was broken in half. So we had a nice chest full of Dr. Pepper.
mhm.
Sarah had brought a real nice deck chair.
My son-in-law made sure that I didn't have to sit on the ice chest, and gave me a wonderful, a beautiful, nice cushioned seat and back, and I just was tooling down like the queen of the river until we hit so many, and I'm sure it was over time. It was the second day that my chair hit a wave, and we just collapsed to the floor completely.
Yeah.
But it was kind of a rough
This would
trip
be
at
Memphis,
times.
Tennessee right here, where Y'all stopped for a few minutes. I found a Kentucky Fried Chicken
That's where the river was so rough.
nearby. And I used a dolly to roll a fuel tank down to the boat and bring you some fried chicken.
Yeah,
down
that's
to the
where we
boat.
met Cheryl and
And they had
Louis
some people
Perret.
from Lafayette, a
Yeah.
family from Lafayette, the Perret family, just happened to be in Memphis that week.
Our
I believe
clerk
there's
of
some
court,
pictures
isn't
of
he
him.
in politics here in Lafayette?
Yeah, so he was at a
Brad, and
con,
he wants to make the same trip, but
right.
he's gonna go on a luxurious, I think he wants to go in a party board, on a party board.
Yeah, he has it in the planning stages, so, I think he needs to consult with you heavily
He needs to consult with me.
on this trip right here. He's not gonna do it in 3 days like you did it. He's gonna go a little further and, go a little bit slower.
You know, in Natchez, we met the Twos, and Mr. Two had taken a party barge trip,
Right.
or a houseboat. What was it, Harold?
It was a party
It was a
barge,
party
but it was
barge.
a livable, it had a cabin aboard, so it was
Yeah,
a pontoon vessel that had, sleeping capacity, had a 115 four-stroke motor pushing it, and he took 10 months to do it. He went up to Tom Bigby into the Tennessee and then into the Ohio, and then came down. But he would go 3 or 4 days and then find a place to park the boat. He could put it on a trailer, and then a week
Fly
or two,
home.
he could come home
Yeah.
and go try it again.
But he talked about the Mississippi, that once he got into the Mississippi, it was a nightmare getting gas. And he had, 7 or 8 little 5-gallon gas cans that he would call a taxi or a pickup truck to come pick him up and have to go into town. So that was.
Yeah, I think he had 25-gallon
Yeah,
tanks. So.
that he would fill up. And so there was our greatness with David being along with us, that we did not have to get out and carry gas tanks. There's Louis and David and
Louis
Harold.
and David and Cheryl,
No, that's, Cheryl's not in that picture.
you were there, yeah.
That's me in the live here, I'm not in the picture.
Lafayette's parish clerk of court, Louis. In Memphis, Tennessee, where we had a brief stop.
You know, one of the photos that was on at the very beginning was the United States and the mammoth amount of area that the Mississippi River watershed covers. It's like 40%, is it? Or is it
Yeah,
greater than that?
40%
of the nation's, the 48 states.
31 states and 2 Canadian provinces that come through.
And there are 10 states that actually cover that touch or are adjacent to the Mississippi River, of which we went through 7 of them. Name them.
Let's see, Missouri, at St. Louis, Illinois.
Kentucky.
Almost 200 miles along Illinois. Kentucky, where the Ohio comes in. And then Arkansas.
And Tennessee.
Tennessee, Mississippi, and Louisiana, 7 of the 10. One of the interesting things that was noticeable, there was no litter in the river. It was hard to spot inflowing rivers. We kept looking for the Arkansas River, and we never did see it, but we did pass by. There's a lot of islands and sandbars, so the river gets wide in places, a mile wide, some places maybe even more. It appears to be enormous, and often you would see the channels shift from one side to the other, and the river's a mile wide, so you would see a tug pushing 50 barges that was going sideways in the river, going across the river, to go from one bank where the channel was to another bank. It was kind of important to stay in the channel, because the rock training devices, they put dams across the river right up to the channel. And those dams keep the current in the channel and keeps the channel deep. But these things are not marked. And there were 3 things that kept us in the channel. 1 was the tugboats. 2 was the actual
Buoys.
the buoys, which have the same markers that we have at Southwest Pass. And 3 was the computer tablet mapping that we could monitor, and it showed where we were and showed where the channel was.
That's a picture of Cape Girardeau,
Girardeau.
and that's a mural that they played. They were big storytellers there. They had a lot of stories about the river and the happenings on it, and there were floods and things, and so they put up this wall, and on the wall they have their stories painted on there.
In all these little river towns, they have charts. They have a gauge that shows how high the river got, and it's kind of interesting to see. Ruthersville, I don't know, went to
47
feet, 47 feet.
47 feet.
And, but each of these towns have the gauge, very visible gauge of the high water periods from the different flood years. This was the type of map that we had with us. Showed about 5 miles intervals. And the problem with it was if you were stopped, you could read the maps. But we're going 30 miles an hour against a 20-mile-an-hour wind. And so there was no way to open a map and turn pages.
So, but I had an app on an iPad, and after we hit our first brick bridge out across the water and just flew over it, I started paying real close attention to what these black lines were meaning on it, and they had a preferred channel that we should stay in, and I constantly was guiding Harold as to get into it and get on it. It was
The meandering of the
that was
river
so
was
great,
amazing because you'd go through these enormous loops, and you'd wonder, golly, if you could cut through the woods right there, you would save, 7, 8 miles. And I'm sure at times there are paths that an outboard could get through those trees, when the river's the right height. But these big loops, sometimes the wind would be right in your face, and you'd make a loop and it'd be in your back. And it was windy, the weather was pretty much inclement during the whole time, so we had rain most of the 4 days. We had rain 3 days. And we weren't camping in tents, so that we were prepared to do that. The ideal was to pull the boat out of the water and bring it to the filling station and tank it up and go spend the night in a motel, and that's what we did. There's a little boat that's taken out near Greenville. And I think that's putting in. Right.
Yeah, it was in Greenville that we saw all of the big tugs. They would bring up the tugs to work them over. They had dry docks there, and it was amazing to see those big tugs.
And they had those. Evidently, that's where they did a lot of work. And talking to the people who run the river. Most of these tugs can tank up in St. Louis and go to New Orleans right without fueling. But when they're going up, that's quite a different story. They're going against the current, that's 4 or 5 miles an hour. My GPS showed that the boat at the RPM I was running runs 26 and a half, 27 miles an hour. And the miles per hour reading was really around 30 or 31 most of the time. Here we are running under one of the bridges.
Yeah. I wonder if that's the Chester, Illinois bridge.
Just amazing, big wide river, and you'd see a big sandbar in the middle of the river. And the sandbars were beautiful. They're maybe 3 or 4 miles long, all beautiful white sand. And on the 4th of July, we did see some boats, people swimming and I guess having picnics on the sandbars.
Yeah.
But really saw very few small boats. And it's interesting, the bridges from below St. Louis down all the way to Old River, there were only 12 bridges.
They were beautiful. They were so pretty.
Beautiful to see, and they were about 100 feet. The span underneath about 100 feet. Yes, some of the bridges. And where they built the bridges is where the river was the narrowest. It was real obvious they looked for a narrow spot to get across. What a feat. the amazing thing of the river is it's a wilderness. You don't see homes on the river. You don't see any crops. We didn't see one crop along the river. It wasn't until we got almost to on the Chafalaya near Krotz Springs, we could see corn growing, but that's the only place on the whole trip where we actually saw any crops from the river. You would see tugs pushing barges of coal, barges of liquids, you couldn't tell what, I would guess refined products going upriver, but most of the barges were grain barges, corn, wheat, soybeans, whatever. Amazing all the states that tie in, that, you know, they have these ways to load the barges with grain that goes down to New Orleans, to our biggest ports. Here's some of the paddle wheelers.
Yeah, those were in at Memphis, I believe.
They were real small.
As we were going to meet David. And that was, I think, the only one that looked like it might still be working. The others looked like they were put into the barns to
Museum.
stay, yeah.
But when we stayed, like in Natchez, it was, has a lot of history there about the river and about the big steamboat race, I guess, in the 1850s. I think the steamboat Natchez and the steamboat New Orleans raced up. I don't remember the names exactly, but they raced upriver from New Orleans to St. Louis. And
They did it in quite quick time, too.
they
didn't
did, and it was amazing. They averaged 11 miles an hour. I think like 4 days.
Yeah.
And it was I bet they didn't have a GPS unit to keep them in the channel. And of course, they didn't have the rock weirs in those days, but these guys had to know that river pretty well to keep them running on sandbars and so forth. They had the little boat. The little motor did amazingly well, didn't have any kind of issues, whatever.
Backing out of the slip to start off the day.
I think that was in Memphis. I mean, Vicksburg. The river was very rough there. Sarah was.
I was coming out of
Memphis said it was so rough.
That it was so rough, and it just seems like the waves went this way, and all different. I thought we were getting ready to turn over right now. But my good captain here kept us afloat, and we made it home.
And the river was discovered by DeSoto, I think in May of 1541. And he discovered it right at Natchez, Mississippi. I think LaSalle is the next guy that really explored the river and claimed it all for France. And that was making a little repair on the boat there. It had a little split along the edge, which is sealed perfectly. It was, I guess, one of those waves that we hit too hard, and there was a chair trying to make the chair repair, which did last for a good part of the trip.
13 miles to the end, and I rode the ice chest in the rest of the way.
Right at Butler Rose, about 13 miles from Butler Rose, it finally collapsed completely. Well, the members of it just broke. This was a chair that should have been on the decks of a 100-foot crew boat, and not on a 16-foot plat tooling down the river in the waves. But LaSalle claimed, he named the river La Louisiana, I guess, and ended up with Louisiana being the delta. But the importance of the river in history is just remarkable. The Battle of New Orleans in January of 1815 was about the Mississippi River. The British had already conquered Canada, and they had established trade along the Mississippi all the way down to St. Louis. Their fur buyers were all the way down, and so they were anxious to capture New Orleans and the whole river and take back the entire Louisiana Purchase and claim it all for Great Britain. And they'd have easily done that had they captured New Orleans. But the river was against them. They had 100 ships and something like 18,000 Army infantry and 3,500 Navy combatants, 100 ships, and they couldn't sail up the Mississippi River. The river was at flood in 1814, 15. It was high in December, January, and the ships could not negotiate a 5-mile-an-hour current up the river. So they ended up in Lake Bourne, and it had to go 7 miles across the marsh to the high ground on the Mississippi and attack New Orleans from the south. And Jackson, with only 3,000 troops, 600 or 700, he didn't even have weapons. He succeeded in saving New Orleans. And New Orleans knew that Jackson didn't stand a chance against over 20,000 combatants and 100 ships with a handful of people. And Jackson told the citizens of New Orleans before he'd surrendered to the British, he'd burn it down to the ground. Every building, everything would be down to the ground before he'd let the British have it. And Jackson had only one ship, the Louisiana, with 32 guns. So the importance of the river, and then the Civil War. The Confederates blocked the river way down about 50 miles below New Orleans near Jesuit Bend at a fort there, and succeeded in blocking it until the Union finally broke through and came in and captured New Orleans. But they didn't have Port Hudson, they didn't have Vicksburg, and long battles were fought at both of these sites. Great loss of life, and the Union never actually militarily captured those Vicksburg and Port Hudson. They eventually starved those communities out, and deprived them of food and rations, and so they eventually both Vicksburg surrendered July 4th, 1863. Probably why they don't celebrate July 4th in Vicksburg, I heard. So the history on the river is something that is very much a part of our country, and the barrier to the west was the Mississippi, and getting across of it had to be something. This is where we went through the locks from the Mississippi to the Chapelaya. You dropped 16 feet. It's an amazing drop, and you can see when you drop in 16 feet, you can't tie on to a spot because you'd be hanging from the side. But they have little floating tie-on devices where, and there's one every 50 feet, and the locks is like 1,000 feet. So you hear, as the river drops, you hear them crackling as they're on little rails, and they're all going down, and your boat stays in place because it's attached to these floating tie-on devices. So that was the easiest part of the trip. From Natchez to Beulah Roses, about 135 miles, and we did that in about 5 hours. Here we are leaving the locks.
That was an impressive thing to go through. It was a 16-foot drop.
And we had a VHF radio on the boat where we, could communicate with the locks, and they could give us the directions of what to do and what to expect. And it's going from the Mississippi was real noticeable when we got below Memphis, about 30, 40 miles. The river got very clear. The water was beautiful and clear. And the river stayed clear all the way to the Old River. And then we got into, and we continually had about a 3 or 4 mile an hour current on the Mississippi. When we got into the Chapelaya, the current was very low, maybe a mile an hour. We have a call. You on there? Can we help you?
Hello. Really enjoyed the show. I wanted to ask a question.
Sure.
I heard you saying that the weather and the waves on the river were rough. Did you at any time find yourself wishing that you had a bigger boat?
You always have the feeling that, the sea is so great and my boat is so small, no matter which size boat you're in. No, the boat was fine. The boat is very dry running, and it'd have been rough in any kind of boat because you have a strong wind against a strong current. The current's going 4 or 5 miles an hour. The wind is blowing 20 miles an hour. These big tows are adding to the churning it up. So, yeah, the advantage of the smaller boat was the range, that we didn't have a problem with fuel, and we knew that would be a problem, that we'd be hauling fuel, so running almost 12 miles to a gallon was very, very important, because with 30 gallons, we could run over 300 miles. So we could have easily done the trip just tanking up twice. That was a compromise, and you're always in a boat, you always wish you were in a bigger one, and that can go to some extremes. But my next size boat, it runs about 6-7 miles to a gallon, so getting the fuel would have been much more of a problem, and it's only a foot long a boat.
And it wouldn't have been any smoother.
And it wouldn't have been any smoother than that one, so.
And I think we've bounced around in the Gulf fishing and so forth, not any worse than what this was. So, or this wasn't any worse than what we've been in the Gulf. So, we did well with the boat.
Yeah, the boat did fine.
I certainly admire your seamanship. Thank you.
Thank you for the call. Thank you.
I admire his seamanship too.
What a challenge. Yeah, I got a bunch of boats at home, and we could have easily taken, any one of them. But one of the considerations was running on a sandbar. And this boat, Sarah and I could get off a sandbar.
Which we did.
Which we did, we did find a sandbar, so.
And this is pulling in Natchez. And this fella here is the son of David Begno's neighbor. And so we were excited to see him.
He's the ex-officio
mayor of Natchez, at least the waterfront there anyway.
Welcome us, and he was the pro at Oak Barn Country Club.
Right, the golf pro.
The golf pro.
And quite a golfer still.
So he's familiar with Lafayette. Of course, knew David. David kind of cares for this guy's mother, who is a neighbor there in the mall area around the oil center.
And our daughter Catherine and her 3 little girls came to meet us at Natchez as well too. David was going to have to go home and start working, and Catherine stayed to put us back in the river the next day and take off. And there's Catherine and Jolie and Cecile and Amelie.
David had to come back for work on the day after the 4th, and if they wouldn't have made it up, would have probably been spending the night on the river, which we were prepared to do. We had tents and everything with us.
Okay. Wow, where is that, David?
This is where the current is
is,
pushing you at Carruthersville.
Beulah
Oh,
Rose?
Beulah Rose,
Oh,
yes,
gosh,
coming
yeah.
in at Beulah Rose, riding up the trail at Beulah Rose. It's 1 o'clock, Tuesday, I think the 5th. This is the 4th day on the river.
There's our friend David Pierce, who met us at not David, Michael Pierce, that met us at the Old River Locks. And he's the one who set me up with this navigation program. And thanks, Michael, I would have never made it back to Louisiana without it. In fact, it's amazing to know that we could have just driven right past the Old River control structure.
That was hard to find.
It's very hard to find, but the navigation
This
app
picture
showed.
is a pipeline crossing. It's not a bridge, it's a pipeline crossing. Somebody went through an awful expense. Another one of the bridges. That's a bridge. Some more of the bridges. That beautiful. The bridge is just beautiful.
You see the high bluffs
The
there.
high bluffs are right below St. Louis, where the rocks are being mined to be put on barges to bring to places like Freshwater Bay in a coastal city. We're going to use a lot of rocks in our coastal restoration planning. I think a lot of them will come from those rock quarries that you're looking at. And very little high ground along the river on the east side. Most of it's on the west side until you get into Mississippi, and then the high ground's on the. Dave is taking a picture of the trailer. I think the fender fell off.
No, it didn't fall off, unfortunately. David said he was about to burn up a tire with it and took it off, so.
Now, that trailer cost me $50 when I bought it in 1971, so this must have been on the Chapelaya because the river's obviously very small. This wouldn't have been on the Mississippi.
Could have
Oh,
been
no, that's,
Merrimack,
that's in
wasn't
the
it?
Merrimack.
It's the Merrimack where we
Because
where
I'm
we put
wearing a
in.
sweater, and the temperature was really cool. The river was about 71 degrees, and so that first leg of the trip, you needed a coat on. That's
It's
the
the
Merrimack.
Merrimack too.
And we met some fellows there with about a 1958 Johnson 30 horsepower motor, something. And they had it running, and they were proud of it. They're recovering an old boat, probably was about a 1958 boat too. This is just below St. Louis on the Merrimack River, about, I guess 15 miles below St. Louis. And there was no decent boat landing in the river at St. Louis. And that's why we used, this was a real nice landing on the Merrimack.
It's where the sand.
That's the sand, but as we approach a bridge, one of the sandbars. Yeah.
And it was amazing, the wind was blowing so up against us that you could see the sand, it was just flying through the air.
At times, you'd have a sandstorm, you'd be running along a sandbar and the wind was blowing so hard, it was picking up the sand and the sand was hitting you. Because there's no vegetation on these sandbars. It's beautiful white sand, it's really pretty to see.
That's where we're standing on the New Madrid fault, is that?
Yes.
I can't see what the
The
bottom
New
word
Madrid.
says, but.
This is where the category 8 earthquake in 1811.
New
Yeah.
Madrid, yeah.
And the New Madrid is it's a floodway. They have about a 200,000 acre floodway. That's all farmland, but it's where the Ohio River comes into the Mississippi. And in an extreme flood, opening the New Madrid lowers stages towards Louisiana 2 feet. So it's a very important part of the flood control system on the Mississippi. It's amazing, constantly you're looking at work of the Corps in training this river, controlling the river, keeping it deep. All these training, all along the banks you have rocks wherever the river would want to erode, it's stacked up with rocks and with concrete abutments.
Yeah, this is in Natchez, where, no, in Memphis, I'm sorry. It's in Memphis where they have the, just a showing of the whole Mississippi. It's kind of a huge map, a walkthrough type of map of the Mississippi River and all of its tributaries that come into it. And it's something that we all said that we were gonna go back up and walk it. What's it take, David? How many hours to walk it? It takes about an hour to walk it.
Of course, Vicksburg is, we didn't stop there, but the most important part of Vicksburg is the Vicksburg Battle Site, which is beautifully maintained. It is a national park. And it's quite a history in that part of the Civil War. It was a turning point in the Civil War. it gave, Grant was the commanding general, and he became the commander of the Union forces after Vicksburg, which was a turning point in the Civil War. And the Natchez Trace,
Yeah.
where the
David,
Indians were
yeah.
forced to leave. The eastern, all the states east of the Mississippi, the Indians were transported or forced to hike and go on foot to go all the way to Oklahoma. That was under the leadership of President Andrew Jackson. And I think that was before, was that right after the Civil War? Before the Civil War. Trail of Tears. And there's a site way up in Illinois. And David went to St. Genevieve. That's a historical community on the river.
Yeah, in fact, I was reading about St. Genevieve, and they talked about that was an area that the French Creole people came into, and it's got one of the largest French Creole architecture in the whole United States. Up there, that they had big floods, and they had to pick up a lot of these homes and move them up to higher ground. But they've managed to preserve a lot of them. And was this at home, or was it? What's that behind us? Where, huh? Butler Rose.
Butler Rose, that's right, Butler Rose coming out of the water. At the end of the trip, right,
Yeah.
about 870 miles,
I was 890.
34 hours of running. It's a trip through history, and it's a wilderness. There's not a lot of civilization on the river itself. Have the greatest respect for the people who run those big tugboats. They have quite a challenge.
David, why don't you get the map and let's.
Okay, we pulled out a few old maps. Anybody knows me knows I don't have any maps past around 1800 and something. So this is one that we pulled out that, let's see if we can get the lighting right here. They started their trip, I'm going to have to stand up with this one right here. Let's see if we can get this thing zoomed in right. This is a 1927 flood map of the Mississippi River showing where it flooded. And they started their trip way up here off the map, about 2 or 3 inches.
Okay.
Cape Girardeau is right here. And they ran all the way down and came through the locks way down here. And so this kind of shows the different flood of 27 where things got flooded. And we have another map we wanted to show. Right here, this would be your Mississippi meander maps right here. This was done in 1944 by Dr. Howard Fisk, and it shows that old paths of the Mississippi River. And this area right here, let's see where we're at on this particular map. Let's see, we're not upside down or anything. This shows right here where they came through the locks around Old River control structure. This is before they had a control structure right here, and the river used to make a big ancient meander right through here, and Captain Shreve made a cut through here in 1831. And so the Red River comes in and joins up, and the Chaffalaya River forms right here. So this shows all your ancient paths, and you get to see a lot of that when you're riding up there. You see a lot of these oxbow lakes all up and down the river. There's just thousands of them going out hundreds of miles from the main riverbed that we have right now. And so it was interesting to see all these, a few of these oxbows as you're traveling down, following the Mississippi River down there.
It was interesting, the water temperature went from about 71 when we put in to about 85 when we came out at Butler Rose. So 71 degrees made it cool on the river the first day.
If you look at an 1816 map of the United States, you can clearly see the Mississippi River is the dominant border. It's the border that separates what was pretty much unknown at the time. It wasn't settled much, in the eastern United States right here. So the Mississippi River was a real history piece in the making of America.
And the St. Louis was the gateway of the wagon trains heading west. That's where they crossed the river and made their way, all the way west to Nebraska, Oregon, California, whatever. The wagon trains assembled in St. Louis, and so it's so interesting to go through the history, that very important part of our history, and it's very important to commerce. It's enormous asset to Louisiana. We're at the bottom end. We receive the benefits. The port of, I guess, the Mississippi port from Baton Rouge to New Orleans is the largest port in the world. And so we need to thank David for being our logistical support the whole trip. We had a tough time making it without
We sure
it.
would have.
We would
That
have
was-
been
that was
camping
a
on the
nice
bank.
adventure. I'd encourage anybody that has any interest in this river to take a trip on the river, maybe in a car first, and get used to it and everything, because not anybody can do that kind of trip. I think most people would have given up after about 12 hours in that river. I think they would have said, I have enough of this
That's it.
river. It's hard to imagine what that river is like.
That's it.